Good evening. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, we are located on ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota lands ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The history department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It's important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve our and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the chair of the History Department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our last History Book Club of this academic year. I'm thankful to our department administrator, Amanda Nelson, who is running the Zoom behind the scenes. And the way this works for those who may not have been here before is that we will have a brief presentation from our featured author today, then a discussion with another colleague, and then towards the end of the hour, there'll be a chance for Q&A from the audience. So you can be thinking about your questions, putting them in the chat whenever you're ready, but I will also remind you to do that at a later point. So it's a great pleasure to welcome our guest this evening. The author, Noam Sienna, completed his PhD here in 2020. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow with the University of Toronto, where he is working with the project called Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book. He is also this semester the Jerome and Lorraine Oresti Visiting Scholar at Rutgers, where he is introducing students to the history of the book with hands-on activities. And I'm pleased to announce that next fall, he will join our department as the Deinard Chair in Jewish History. We'll be talking about his really exciting book, Jewish Books in North Africa, Between the Early Modern and Modern Worlds, that was published last year by Indiana University Press, and is a really fascinating study that both interrogates the materiality of books and the way they create connections and relationships between people. So I know it's going to be a great discussion. He has also published as an editor a book called A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the first century to 1969. And that won 2 awards, the Reference Award from the Association of Jewish Librarians and the 2019 Anthology Award from the Lambda Literary Association. We're also joined by my colleague, J.B. Shank, who's an interdisciplinary scholar of early modern European intellectual and cultural history and the history of science and history of books. And I'm thankful that he's taking time to be with us this evening while he is on sabbatical working on a project about the old regime Académie Royale des Sciences in France. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Noam to tell us a bit about the book, and then we'll bring JB into the conversation.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. And I want to thank, first of all, Sarah for the invitation, and to Amanda and everyone in the department for arranging this, and JB for joining me in conversation and already prompting me to think about this book and this project in deeper and deeper ways. I think in some ways you publish a book and you think, it's out there, now it's over, but actually I feel like now I've just started to understand this project. Now that the book is out and I'm having conversations about it and hearing people's reflections on it, now I'm really at the beginning of the journey of really understanding this. So hopefully there are more and more to come. So what I thought I would do, I'm just actually going to put up the cover so everybody can see so here's the cover of the book. So I'm just going to make a few comments to give you a little bit of the behind the scenes of how the book came together. And then I'll share a little bit about the structure of the book itself, and I'll give you one example, kind of a little case study from the book, so you get a taste of it, and then we can turn it over to conversation and discussion. So this book came together, as you heard, and as some of you actually know quite well, as my doctoral dissertation at the University of Minnesota, which I wrote under the supervision of Dr. Daniel Schrader. And the question began for me, the research began for me because I was already focusing on early modern North Africa, and I was really interested in the history of Jews in the Islamic world, and I was also really interested in material culture. I was pursuing a graduate minor in museum studies, and I really wanted to think about objects, and I wanted to think about an object that would allow me to tell a story about Jewish history. And I thought, maybe I would write about clothing or jewelry or architecture, and none of them really seemed rich enough. And one day, early on in graduate school, I remember realizing, oh, books, wait a second, books are objects. I could write about the book as not just as a text, but as an object. And I was thinking, actually, I had taken a course on medieval manuscripts and medieval manuscript illustration. So my initial research question was actually centered around manuscript culture and scribal practice. I wanted to think about Jewish manuscripts after the Middle Ages. In what ways were they continuous with the medieval tradition? In what ways were they innovative? How were they shaped by their environment? How were they shaped by their local context? And what I found, and really what I didn't find, was I didn't find nearly as much material as I was hoping for regarding manuscripts. We don't have really extensive records of scribes, their training, the artists who decorated manuscripts, and the manuscripts themselves that we have from the early modern period from North Africa don't have the dramatic imagery or narrative illustrations of their medieval predecessors that are so rich to think with and write with. And so I was a little disappointed, but as I was working on manuscripts, I started finding material that related to how manuscripts were being brought into print. And even though initially I wasn't interested in print at all, I realized two things. First, I realized that printing books in the early modern period was just as labor intensive and intentional and collaborative a process as medieval manuscript making had been. So it's important to think about that. And the second was that manuscripts and printed books, certainly in the Jewish world at least, continued to coexist and cross-pollinate with each other well into the 19th and early 20th centuries. So that led me to broaden my scope to thinking holistically about book culture across manuscript and print. And so after that, really the rest came together pretty easily. I mean, obviously there was a lot of work, but I traveled to archives, I traveled to collections with North African material across North America, in Europe, in Israel. I did a lot of research with digitized primary material. I am very pleased with how it all came together. So I defended and then published some pieces from the dissertation as standalone articles. And then when I came back to the dissertation to revise it into a book, I returned to some of the material that I hadn't been able to get into in the dissertation. And so I wrote a few additional chapters for the book based on some of the feedback I'd received and based on how my thinking had evolved, primarily with my postdoctoral fellowship with the Hidden Stories Project in Toronto that Sarah mentioned. And so that's how the final book emerged. So the structure of the book has essentially three parts. So after the introduction, the first two chapters deal with manuscript culture. Then the second two chapters explore how North African Jews related to print technology through European printing houses in the 17th through 19th centuries. And then the final two chapters look at what's happening in North Africa, primarily in the 19th century, with the establishment of a local printing industry, a Jewish printing industry, and then the circulation of Jewish books from printing houses to bookstores and then into libraries and book collections. And that's the final chapters on libraries. So so I want to give you one example from the book and talking about libraries. So the final chapter in the book, I compare two libraries. The second of which was the library of a rabbi named Avner Yisrael Sarfati. He lived from 1827 to 1884, so covering pretty much the middle chunk of the 19th century. He was the head of the rabbinic court in the city of Fez in Morocco. He was considered a leading scholar, an authority for Jews all over North Africa, and he was even also consulted by Muslim scholars. He was in conversation with Muslim colleagues as well. He was interested not only in rabbinic law and theology, but also in what we might quote unquote call secular sciences, medicine, astronomy, geography, and in fact, history. In fact, in 1879, toward the end of his life, he composed a book on the history of Jews in Morocco, which was the first work of modern scholarship on Sephardi history that was authored from within the community. And in fact, I argue that it's the first real work of scholarship of any kind to devote attention to Jewish life in modern North Africa. And this book is called Yachas Fez, which means the view of Fez. And in addition to his book, Sarfati also left in manuscript a catalog of his personal library containing about 1,000 books, which so I identified this catalog in an archive in Israel. And so I analyzed the contents of his library and what he was reading, along with how we see him using his library in his book, Yachas Fez, on the history of Fez. What is really interesting to me is how he combines all different areas and genres and ways of knowing: traditional rabbinic scholarship, modern scientific scholarship, both Jewish and non-Jewish in origin, and then local knowledge, which includes collaborative conversation with Islamic scholars. And he several times quotes that he says, quote, the Muslim scholars who are with me, who are in conversation with me in my library, told me such and such a thing about the history of Fez or about the geography of Morocco or such and such a thing. And I'll just quote here a little excerpt from my sort of concluding summary. The library of Avner Yisrael Sarfati, both as documented in his catalog and visible through his scholarship, was both a storehouse of history and a place of collaborative work. His book collection paints a portrait of a scholar who is deeply fascinated by the world and the place of Jewish people in it, someone who understood themselves to belong both to the modern world and to the Jewish tradition, and someone who understood those two modalities as not necessarily oppositional, but complementary. Drawing on centuries of Moroccan Jewish book history and traditional rabbinic citation, while engaging in the practices of modern scholarship, including material bibliography, textual criticism, and manuscript collation, Sarfati centered the Jews of Morocco as a valid and valuable subject of historical inquiry. He thus offered a Moroccan Jewish vision of modernity rooted in its own history and looking toward its future. So that is a little taste of, I'm gonna stop sharing. So that's a little taste of the library of Sarfati. There's of course a whole chapter on it if you want to get into the nitty gritty. And hopefully a little taste of the kind of questions that my book explored. So I think I will leave it at that, and I am going to turn it over to JB to grill me on various points of importance. We'll take it from there.
Right. Thank you. No, Noam, you've long left behind your prelim exam mode and have now moved all the way to the point of being appointed an endowed chair. So we're done with grilling. We
All
are
right.
now academic peers who are going to think about this book.
Wonderful.
Here's my copy. So I have it here if you ever need to push me to pages or whatever on it. Let me just say for everybody here, including those, and I'm sure there's one or two of you who maybe haven't read the book yet, might be coming to this to decide whether you want to read the book or get the book. I want to give it a serious plug that I don't want you to take lightly as something I would say about every book, particularly about every book that's a first book based on a doctoral dissertation. This is unlike many first book doctoral dissertations, a joy to read. It is beautifully written and it's very much a book. It's a book that works you through in a very systematic way, a set of arguments. There's a beginning, middle, and end to it, even if there's questions we can ask about how to take the story that Noam is telling us. And so it's to be recommended if you're interested in these topics. So we have many things. We've been trading emails, Noam and I, about what we might talk about. And there's just tons of things, including things we don't want to get too much into the weeds of it, especially since not everyone has read it. But at the same time, it's a really complex book and there's all kinds of super interesting issues to get into. So I want to try to do that, but also try to keep it enough in an accessible way for everyone. So there's two themes that sort of I want to start with that hopefully will open up lots of the other themes. The two are really, well, I'll start with the first. The subtitle of the book, Jewish Books in North Africa, is Between the Early Modern and the Modern. Throughout the book, the category of the modern and the early modern, there's never a moment of sort of clarifying what's early about the early modern, the modern, but the modern is there, and you just heard it in Noam's opening description by setting up a pairing of the modern world and Jewish tradition. So this question of how this book is about the early modern, or what we like to say at Minnesota these days, the pre-modern. I'm a big fan of the a-modern, the sort of, but the all of those point to the big bad word that we want to talk about, which is the modern, and what exactly the modern is for you in this book, Noam, for you as you're thinking about this. And then the sort of vector to open that up is the way this book, using this category of the Jewish book, opens into two zones where the question of the modern and modernization are really central categories in that historiography. And these are two distinct, they're not sort of far apart. They can easily be brought together in many ways, but Noam explicitly does while keeping them separate. And that the two I'm thinking about is Jewish history, how this account of diasporic Sephardic Jews in North Africa and the Maghreb who are attempting to sort of navigate their lives in the face then of this thing we'll call modernity. We'll know what that is. And how the Jewish book is a vehicle for us understanding that. But then flipping that around, the way in which the literature on the history of the book is nothing if not saturated with claims about modernization and modernity. The book itself, and particularly printing has a long tradition, going back to the 18th century even, of being one of the fundamental markers of modernity, to have print, to be a society of the book. And I'll just note, Noam starts by talking about the Jews in relation as well to Muslims and Christians as being known as people of the book. So there's a modern question about books, but there's also this sort of deeper and unmodern or pre-modern or more about books as objects and as sites of culture. So put this into two questions, and you can go in this any direction you want, and I'll try to keep it on the rails by follow-up questions. But basically, what for you is modernity, or what's the modern? How is your work showing us about the modern, and in particular, or what the modern is and what it's about? And then particularly in the context of how is your book intervening in Jewish history to think about modernization or the modern within Jewish history? And how is it also intervening in the scholarship on the history of the book and the idea of the book, particularly here, the printed book, which you spend a lot of attention on it and distinguishing it from the manuscript book and other kinds of print phenomena. How is it, as you work an intervention in the modernization story about books and the history of the book? Clear
Great.
enough for,
Yes, yes. I mean, great questions and really central,
right.
right to
We'll
the
take
center of
them
it.
one at a time, and pick off one you like.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's say a few things. First of all, I like a modern. That's very interesting. I'm gonna keep thinking about that. I mean, the first thing I'll say about modernity, about the modern, certainly in this book, in my book, um, I think in some ways there are actually two modernities that are happening at the same time. One is the modernity that is being talked about and um, structured through the, let's call it the secular European colonial framework that North African Jews are encountering, that they have been encountering since at least the early 19th century, if not even the 18th century, but that really is really heightened and intensified in the second half of the 19th century. And then the second is, maybe we can call it like a potential or possible modernity, which is the vision of what it means to be a modern North African Maghrebi Jew that is being envisioned from within North African Jewish society itself. And that's, like, that's, if we take like Sarfati, for example, like what I'm trying to say is if we have a binary where there's modern French secular identity on the one hand and traditional religious Jewish a-modern rabbinic, whatever, on the other hand, then Sarfati, that model doesn't really work, because in that sense, we would say, well, Sarfati is, he's a Judeo-Arabic speaking, Hebrew writing, religious, rabbinic authority. So he is not modern. But from his perspective, he is engaged very deeply in thinking about what it means for him to live in his time. And he's accepting some of the postulates that are being offered, and he's rejecting others of them, right? So he is accepting, for example, he writes this book, Yachas Fez. He actually writes it, and he talks about this in his introduction. He writes this book because one of his colleagues actually goes to Europe, goes to Paris in 1878, and has a meeting with the head of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which is this philanthropic Jewish universalizing educational behemoth in the period. And the head of the Alliance says to this rabbi, tell me about the Jews of Fez. How many are there? How many synagogues are there? How long have you been living there? How many families are there? And he doesn't know. And he asks Sarfati to write up a little summary. And Sarfati goes to his library and looks through, okay, here's Gratz's 8-volume history of the Jews from the 1940s. And here's, all of this modern Maskilic which means sort of like modern Jewish Enlightenment era scientific literature about Jewish history, and they have like one page about North Africa. Not even Gratz, I think, has one paragraph in his 8 volumes of Jewish history. He has one paragraph about North Africa. So Sarfati sort of has this like realization that there's this conversation that's happening, and his world is somehow not in it, even though he is living in the 19th century just as much as anybody else is. So he has to like create. So he writes this book to sort of write his own experience into, and he's using all of the same tools that he sees and he writes about. He says, like he writes about, okay, I'm comparing these manuscripts to evaluate which of them is older and therefore more authoritative. And, I wanted to know about the history of this place. So I went and, looked for the oldest tombstone that I could find and recorded it. And, he's, in other words, he's doing scholarly, he says, I saw that, so-and-so in his work on the geography of Germany wrote about, the latitude and longitude of these places. So I'm going to do the same thing for Morocco. So he's engaging in what he's understood to be modern practices of scholarship. But he's saying, I can do that without giving up on the aspects that root me in my local context, that connect me to my Muslim neighbors, that connect me to my North African cultural, milieu, my habitus, which not everybody makes that choice. Some Jews in the 19th century, and I talk about some of them also in the book, some North African Jews sort of bite the biscuit or drink the Kool-Aid or whatever the metaphor is, and sort of frankify, Gallicize themselves and try to climb the kind of Euro directional ladder. The end of that story, I don't really get into in the book, because I end the book at the end of the 19th century. But I think what the 20th century demonstrates over the course of the 20th century is the degree to which that sacrifice comes back to haunt many of the much of the trajectory of North African Jews in the 20th century. Many of them are betrayed in the Second World War when they've given up Arabic, they've given up North African culture to become French. They become French citizens, and then Vichy France basically abandons them, and they have this kind of deep sense of betrayal of, Western European Enlightenment values were supposed to save us, and instead they actually made things worse, and then the Algerian War. Anyway, that's getting into the 20th century. But so that's on modernity.
Well,
So
can we stop there for a second?
yeah.
Yeah, because I think, so I get what you're saying about the 20th century with the following reference. I was recently in a situation where I was listening to, I think it was in fact, maybe the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, Germany might have been where it was, where they had this very interesting exhibit where you could put on contemporary commentators who were Jewish, who would talk about certain questions. And I think it was in that context where I remember one of them talking about the assimilation, which is what you're talking about, right? As in effect, the great trap for Jews.
Yeah.
That the minute Jews decide that they are being welcomed in to non-Jewish society and are willing to give up certain traditions to assimilate, they're setting themselves up from the moment where they then, ironically, one might say, are more vulnerable than ever to being called out, and that this was a sort of argument for a need to continually defend Jewish tradition, and at the same time, not to the exclusion of trying to be part of the modern world. So with that in mind, come back to Sarfati. So I understand what you're talking about with assimilation and then the Kool-Aid or the, but tell us more about what it meant for, I guess it was Sarfati you were describing, who saw a vision of being, and this is central to your book. You talk a lot about these people who are very committed to defending, in many ways, the traditions of Judaism and particularly their Maghrebi and North African traditions, while at the same time thinking there's no reason that that should cause a problem with being modern. So I guess the question to think about, or I would be interested to think about, is help us understand better what that vision was exactly, what it looked like, when was it okay to be
Yeah.
not traditional that way, and maybe then getting into the book as a vehicle for this. I mean, your
Yeah.
book shows how this becomes a vehicle for, at least for the period you study,
Yeah.
for sustaining this kind of third way in
Yeah.
this way. How
Yeah.
did that work exactly?
I mean, so I think so. The biggest thing that I'll say, I mean, there was no one vision. I mean, that everyone had their own. You know, that's why I say it's like a potential. It was a possibility that different people envisioned in different ways, and um, you know, Sarfati is, you know, we could say, you know, on one end of the spectrum of the possible, where, you know, he was really, for all of his modern scholarly intellectual work, he was really a traditional rabbi in terms of his the material vision of what, you know, he wanted life to look like. There were also on the other end of the spectrum people who really envisioned something more akin to what we would recognize as liberal secular democracy. But the big thing that is sort of at the center of all of these visions, which doesn't really get carried out into the 20th century, is the space of the North African context, the Maghreb in Arabic, as a stage. Like, that's where this is going to happen. And so for most of these figures that I write about, this means writing in the Judeo-Arabic language. And this is the problem that they face, is this binary that they've received and that they've heard, and some of them have internalized from educators from the Alliance or from France or from wherever, is, you know, French is a modern language. French is a modern European scientific language because it has words for things like democracy and science and politics. And Arabic, and by extension Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew, are not modern languages because they're religious and they're traditional and they're medieval and they're, you know, rooted in all of the, you know, on everything that's on that end of the binary. And so the challenge for many of these writers was to create a modern Judeo-Arabic language. And by the way, Arabic writers are doing this almost at precisely the same time in Arabic. This is, you know, a period of great creativity in the Arabic, you know, that writers in Egypt and in Syria and in Iraq and Lebanon are all thinking about, okay, you know, what does modern Arabic, you know, what does it look, I mean, legit, like even down to the grammar, like how do you conjugate, you know, these verbs? We need new vocabulary. We need words for democracy and, you know, politics and all of that. So, so these writers and intellectuals, you know, part of what they're doing is, and they write about it. Some of them write about it quite explicitly. There's one of the things that I talk about in the book is there's a journalist named Nissim Benisti in Algiers, in Algeria, and he starts the first Judeo-Arabic newspaper in 1870 in Algeria. And he, in its opening editorial, he says, the reason why I've started this newspaper is because we, well, you know, I'm just going to actually read it instead of trying to remember it off the top of my head, because his language is so interesting here. So he says, we Algerians, okay, so already right off the bat, this is very, when he says we Algerians, he means Jews and Muslims, which this is like, French colonial Algerians might say we Algerians, but what they mean is we French people who are living in Algeria. He means we Algerians, he says, must be initiated into this path of modernization gradually. We must first accustom ourselves to understanding ideals in this Jewish Arabic language, which, despite being our mother tongue, has had neither rules of grammar nor any systematic organization. Until now, it has served only for our commercial needs. It is still difficult to express any sort of deep idea with it. So his idea is, I'm going to start this newspaper and I'm going to start writing small articles, and I'll translate words, and I'll create new words, and I'll slowly build up a reading public, a discourse, a community of discourse where we can have conversations about citizenship, about representation, about education, about secularization in our native tongue, right? In Judeo-Arabic, in this Jewish Arabic language, which is, it's our native tongue for we Algerians, but it has this potential, like it's not yet ready to be a fully, modern language, but it has that potential. So that's, for me, that's the vision. And they sort of, it's a very narrow, it's really just one generation. It's
Yeah,
like
right, exactly.
from the second half of, like, from the 1860s, 1870s, really until the first decade of the 20th century. And so there's this narrow window in which maybe two generations of North African Jewish intellectuals are thinking and writing about this, and they for a number of reasons they don't really succeed in getting it off the ground enough. But they try, and I think it's worth sitting with their vision, even if it didn't come into being. I think
Exactly.
it's still worth thinking through, if only because in our time now, where we, for other reasons, might have a reason to reflect critically and perhaps skeptically on some of the promises of what liberal secular democracy is supposed to do for the world. And we might be wondering, are there alternative paths to envisioning what our society can look like? It's helpful to have as many tools in our toolbox, and that's like part of what studying history is about, is excavating these paths not taken, and trying to excavate, okay, what possibilities are there that could be generative for us to think with now. That's the project.
No, I mean, and I love that. I mean, one of the few ways I like using the phrase early modern is precisely that, as a notion of a moment in which modernities are emergent. So it's what's early, right? It's modernities are urgent, but they're not modernities. They're early modernities because, exactly as you say, they might be places that are positing alternative modernities or alternative directions that are very useful to go back to and use to think about the modernities we have in that way. I mean, I think about Reinhard Koselleck, the great German historian Reinhard Koselleck, talks about futures past. So this, you're in a sense talking about the future that was envisioned
Right.
by Maghrebi Jews in the early mid-19th century that have now ceased to be, or have become different futures in that way. But the work of history is to bring them back. And I mean, that I see a great segue here to get into this sort of, and I like, if you allow me to follow you with this sort of, your book doesn't have a kind of meta reflection like this, which of course is because you finished your book, which is what good students do, and now you're being forced to rethink it all. But anyway, that's all good. It doesn't get pulled out of the library afterwards. Don't worry about that. It'll always be there. But and it's this what you're talking about now is seeing the story you're telling as having a kind of I don't know, poignant sort of quality, and being an account of a set of peoples that had maybe a really wonderful heroic vision of a kind of Jewish modernity that didn't come to pass. And so then if you accept that frame, then the question is to think about, well, what went wrong exactly, or why didn't it? And one way is saying assimilation is the only answer or something like that. But I think this is where you get into some of the really interesting ways in which you merge the history of the book with the history of Judaism. There's no question of modernity. And what I'm thinking about is in stories of modernization brought about through a turn to print and a turn to the book, things that follow from the arrival of the book and its acceptance as the standard media form are things like corresponding increase in literacy.
Mm-hmm.
The transformations, this is particularly, you cite in your book Roger Chartier, but he's done all kinds of work with this, of the change in the nature of people's relationships to books, that books stop being the sacred books. I mean, he talks about in an essay how in 18th century France, 17th to 18th century France, French people go from having one book, if any at all, that being the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
to having all kinds of books, cookbooks, novels, all these sorts of things. So that's another way in which the book brings a kind of modernity. I mean, another is secularization, where secularization doesn't have to be assimilation. It simply has to be the willingness to allow your religious practices to stand alongside those of others and to join into a kind of social arrangement. So this is where the Enlightenment idea of tolerance, right, that leads to the idea of emancipation for religious minorities like Jews, as that was the language of the 19th century, become modes of secularization that are not necessarily assimilation, or they don't have to be. And often books become key ways for that. I mean, you know, I've talked to you a little bit about the stuff I've done on Dutch publishing.
Mm-hmm.
There's these movements starting in the 17th century to produce these multilingual kind of books that sort of bridge, particularly holy books like the Bible, where you'll get it reduced, first of all, to core passages and then have them published side by side in German, French, Latin, Hebrew, sometimes in this way. So maybe talk now about what's happening with the Jewish book in the 19th century. And I'll kind of load the question. It struck me that these are not the sort of things that are happening, at least at first. That something like, well, for literacy of women,
Right.
you say, really is a product of the AIU. It's only the AIU and with French that you start getting a full fledged
Mm-hmm.
reading public of women. There's also an attachment still to rabbinical literature and a kind of rabbinical thing. Not as there's a few, but not as many. Maybe great novels or this. The newspaper was a great example, but the newspaper isn't sort of a super success, right? It doesn't sort of thrive. So I'll stop there. You get the
No,
point.
it's a good observation, and I think the first thing the first thing that brings to mind is to one of the arguments that I make sort of in the middle section of the book is we are going to be disappointed if we approach North African Jewish books looking for the kind of transformative effect that it seems to have had in Europe.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is I think we are incorrectly making an assumption that that there was the arrival of this thing called printing in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, and then the poor people in the Middle East are waiting to receive it until the 19th century, and then they discover, they encounter it in the 19th century, but then they don't have the same effect. And the truth is, and this I show in the book, North African Jews, let's leave aside Muslims for a second, North African Jews are aware and in fact even involved in the printing industry in Europe already starting in the early 16th century. So they are
the stuff about Livorno is amazing. It's really
right.
well defended.
They're going to Venice, they're going to Livorno, they're going to Florence. Sometimes they go even farther afield. There are North African Jews in Amsterdam, in Antwerp, all over Europe. And so they know very well what printed books are and what printed books are doing and what printed books can do. And uh, again, I'm interested in shifting to considering whether this was more of an active choice on their part of what books they were interested in printing and reading. And this is parallel to another question that I'm working on right now in my current project and thinking a lot about, which has to do with the supposed rejection of print by the Islamic world generally, right? And scholars say, well, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, rejected printing or banned printing because it was threatening or it was scary or whatever. And the more that I think about it, the more that I wonder whether it makes sense to actually say that a more accurate view of what happened would be that scholars and readers in the Ottoman Empire encountered printed books from Europe in Arabic in the 16th century and said, no, thank you. We don't want these. They are not bringing benefit to us. And so we're not interested. And in fact, not only are we not interested, it's actually the aesthetic, right? The ugliness of these, Venetian Arabic books from the 16th century are actually offensive.
Right.
Like our book culture has, such a vibrant and efficient mode of production that's already enmeshed inside our networks such that we don't need this. So to get back to the Jewish side of things, I wonder if in this sense, Jews are, the Jewish book over the course of the 19th century, yeah, you're right. There are attempts to say, okay, let's create, let's get journalism, let's have, let's translate all of this, modern literature into Judeo-Arabic, let's make a modern Judeo-Arabic literary language, let's, make textbooks. It doesn't happen, and I think part of it is that there's what had happened over the course of the 18th, the 17th and 18th centuries is maybe unintentionally, like certain modes of print became ingrained, like there was a kind of a groove of, the movement of rabbinic scholars around the Mediterranean facilitated the publication of a certain kind of book. Yeah. And, the fact that mercantile families had these deep ties between Tunis and Livorno facilitated the publication of certain kinds of books. Yeah. And that's what a printed book meant. And while Jews may have been well aware that their neighbors and even co-religionists in Livorno were also reading other kinds of books, and they might have read them while they were in Livorno too. There wasn't a need for it. It didn't have the cultural necessity. And the last thing I'll say that is really one of the big defining factors that distinguishes Jewish book culture in Europe from Jewish book culture in the Middle East is Jewish books in Europe, starting already in the 16th century, are at the nexus of Jewish Christian relations and all of the complex power struggles and dynamics that entails. Christian Hebraists, Christian scholars who are trying to read the Bible and Talmud, Jewish scholars who are trying to navigate Christian censorship. All of that shapes a very particular landscape for what Jewish books can and can't do in Europe
Right.
that's
No,
completely absent in the Islamic world.
no, exactly. And so let me just say, and the fact, again, shifting to a history of the book approach at it, the fact that Amsterdam is such a key site for this means you get this through no agency really of anybody or any group, this highly potent model that starts to exert itself and become then, as you said, the de facto model. And
Yeah,
you do a great job in the book of getting over and dissolving completely this idea that only printed books are modern. And this is true in the history of the book literature going into in Europe, that this continuing interface of manuscript with print and this and that is always there. So there's that. But I think I also like your point about the um, Arabic readers seeing printed Arabic books and kind of hold their nose and say, we don't want this. It makes me think, and that maybe in that choice, in retrospect, in some kind of overly determined story of progressive modernization, this set the Arabic speaker people backwards or something like this. There's a really well-known trope in scholarship on history of technology to not confuse what the market and society chooses as the best technology with
right,
what is in fact the best technology. And the
right.
examples you always use is in a perfect world, we would all have Betamax because it was a much better system for doing what it did than VHS, and which both of them are gone anyway, but you say that way. But similarly, I like the one, I mean, the PC is a complete bowdlerization of the Macintosh. And now the fact that 80% of computer users are using PCs and not actually the original products that is again a sign, and that's market power and all these things. So you're really saying something, saying this in a similar way about cultural development, that you can't just posit these perfect outcomes and then measure everything that way. And I'll end with this, and because I want to make sure we have time for the audience to ask questions. But when you say that your book is dispelling from the beginning and throughout a set of expectations that are used to disparage or to keep on the margins that Maghrebi community and their Jewish books and things like that. It's spot on, and you do an excellent job, even if ultimately there isn't a kind of triumphant story of the victim of or the triumph of these underdogs, but it's nevertheless it gives us an example of a different kind of world, different kind of modernity, different kind of set of priorities, and what that meant that is really fruitful to think with. So um, by my watch, we got about 10
Yeah,
minutes
yeah,
left,
perfect.
right? So let's see if anybody out there would like to ask Noam some questions.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of put in because this is a fascinating discussion about the sort of big picture implications of your book and these questions about modernity. But for those who may want to pick up the book, the other side of it is these incredible smaller moments that capture that. The notion that you open a book and you see the stains from wax and okay, this book was used in a service with candles, or, letters going back and forth about I lent out this book. I really need to get it back. Can somebody let me know where it's been seen? Or carrying a manuscript to Livorno and waves wash over the boat and mess with the paper and the ink. And so these big questions are important, but some of the reason I think that it's so readable and pulls in the reader is all these human moments. So that it's a physical book,
Yeah.
it's shifting cultures, but it's also the humanity of these exchanges that happen around these books. So that was something that really drew me in.
Thank
So
you.
I hope that there may be some questions from the
Yeah,
audience. And
while we're thinking, I just want to that's I really I really appreciate hearing that because it gets to exactly what I was trying to do with this book. And I don't think I made it into the book because let me do a little search. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, I put it back in the introduction at the last minute. I came when I started in Toronto. I overlapped briefly with one of my old teachers, the late Natalie Zeman Davis of blessed memory, who was really, her work is so formative for me, and I went back to one of her very first essays about book history. And in it, she wrote that the printed book, she was talking about printed books, but she says the book is not merely a source for texts or ideas or images, but it is a carrier of relationships. And that image encapsulated.
That quote's in the book.
Yeah,
Don't worry.
it's in the book. Yeah, but it's in its physicalness, right? That's what you're talking about, Sarah. The book is the carrier of relationships, in no small part because the physical book comes into being through the network of these relationships. Who, brings the manuscript to a printer, or the scribe who writes it, and the bookbinder who binds it, and the people who pass it from one library to another. So that's the book, the physical book is the site where we can see those relationships made visible. So that's part of what has really animated my work and continues to animate my work in the moment. Okay.
Yeah.
Ellen
And we
said,
have a question from Ellen Sampson in the chat, which I think is a good one because you started out with the case study of Fez, but this book is so much bigger than that. So she asked, what is the geographic scope of this very, very interesting project? Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, Libya.
Okay, so the geographic scope is focused more or less, centered more or less on the Jewish communities of what in Arabic is called El Maghrib, which is the Arabic-speaking coast of North Africa. Libya is sort of on the boundary of, is it part of the North African side of the Maghreb, or is it sort of with the Egypt, Libya kind of western edge of the Eastern Mediterranean side of things? For the purposes of this book, I left Libya out. There are Jewish communities in Libya who have very interesting things happening, but first of all, they don't produce an enormous amount of books in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it gets more active. But linguistically, the Judeo-Arabic of Libya is much closer to Egyptian Arabic, and it's much more different from. So there's sort of a line between Tunisia and Libya that kind of makes sense to draw the line there. So it's really Morocco, the modern countries of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and the Jewish communities of those countries as they move around. And so some of them, there are little diaspora pockets in Livorno in Italy, in Ottoman Palestine, in Egypt. There's sort of a little chapter section of this kind of relationship between North African Jews in North Africa, North African Jews in Egypt. They're going back and forth. In other parts of Europe, in the Low Countries, as we mentioned, in Amsterdam, but focused really on North Africa in the sort of classic triad of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And of course, those three countries also have very different trajectories in the 19th century. In the early modern period, Morocco is an independent kingdom. Algeria and Tunisia are provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Algeria becomes French in 1830. Tunisia becomes French only in the 1880s. And so they have kind of these three separate, they kind of increasingly diverge over the course of the 19th century. So that's one of the interesting things is, in what ways are these three territories similar? And of course, Jews move across borders, and there are families with sort of half branch in Algeria on one side of the border and the other branch on the Moroccan side of the border. The last thing I'll say about geography is that I also want to acknowledge that, it's in some ways all of these boundaries are artificial, and Jews from Fez, for example, in some ways have much more in common with Jews of similar sized cities in Algeria, like Oran, let's say, than they might with a Jew from like a rural village in the Atlas Mountains, even though they are technically in the same country. There are certain features that the coastal regions share. For example, Tangier, Tetuan, Rabat, Casablanca, Oran, Algiers, and Tunis, which are all like port cities on the coast, share certain characteristics that the inland cities, regardless of what country they happen to be in, so there are multiple ways that we could split, how do we want to divide up these materials? Is it large city versus rural settlement? Is it coastal region versus inland? Is it French versus Ottoman versus, independent kingdom? Is it, these are all different ways to slice the data.
Well, we're coming up on the hour here, and another point I want to make to people of the book. You were very modest, Noam, at the beginning about. So then I went off and did research, but clearly, since these books and these people are traveling around all these different countries and cities and port cities, and the books themselves, the libraries, get broken up in modern period and the books get scattered, and you're trying to reconstruct through correspondence, not just looking at the books, but finding other and ephemera, sort of other printed matter that, may be compiled into a book, but doesn't start its existence as a book, that it's really a tour de force and a fascinating sort of journey. We have the journeys of the books, the journeys of the Jewish people. And in the back of my mind, I'm imagining your journeys as a historian going to these different archives. So like JB, I really recommend this book as one that has these multiple levels and stories and journeys and big picture takeaways that JB was getting at. So I really want to thank Noam for sharing this book with us, to JB for posing the questions. I think JB, you may be trying to get a word in, or are you?
I just wanted to add one little wrinkle for Ellen, because just if you haven't read the book and you don't know this history already, this might not be evident to you. But one of the really important sites for this book is the Italian city of Livorno, which Noam just mentioned is a place with a very established Jewish community there. But as he talks about in the book, and as I know about as a historian of early modern Europe, Livorno in this period is a specifically targeted city under the jurisdiction of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando I, and is being developed not only through its printing presses, but in all kinds of ways. So Tuscany is centered in Florence. Florence has access to the Arno, to the ocean, but that involves Pisa, where they have a long-standing conflict. And so the idea of Livorno is to be this opening of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany to the Mediterranean, an opening that for him, for the Grand Duke, means getting the Jewish population connected and involved in this. And what Noam shows in the book is how this becomes a site for a whole set of international and inter-Mediterranean Jewish activities around the book, because Livorno also has a printing industry, a printing press in this way. So I mean, it really is a book centered on the books as material objects that adopts a kind of network analysis to show how these different communities are both together, but also in a kind of distance relationship, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, or this, whatever. So it really is an amazingly transnational, trans-Mediterranean study, even if you never let go of the fact that it's about Maghrebi Jews. And
Mhm.
originally from Spain and Iberia. So, but
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Read the
and
book.
Noam has said he can stay on for a few minutes. So as we close out, if you'd like to stay on, since we didn't get to many audience questions, and Amanda is putting a few notices in the chat. We haven't published our schedule, but we have a number of faculty who are publishing books next year. So we're going to have book clubs on topics ranging from history of tourism to the history of consumer protection next year. And if you keep an eye on our website there, and of course, we'll send out notices as well, you'll see what's coming up next fall and then the following spring. And then, if you are so inclined, people like Noam who had to write dissertations, we do encourage you, if you're able, to make a donation to our graduate fellowship fund, which is supporting the scholars who are going to write the books of the future. But with that, many thanks again to Noam and to JB and to all of you for tuning in this evening. Thank you.